All right, well, let's start. Good morning, everybody. I'm Linda Feldman, Washington Bureau Chief of the Christian Science Monitor. Our guest today is Radosław Sikorski, the Foreign Minister of Poland. He's already familiar to many of us here as former chair of the European Parliament Committee on U.S. Relations, and in December he embarked on his second tour as Polish Foreign Minister. Mr. Sikorski has also previously served as Poland's Defense Minister and Speaker of the lower house of the Parliament. He's a graduate of Oxford and is in Washington today with both the President, as you all know, President and Prime Minister of Poland, for meetings with President Biden and on Capitol Hill. This is Minister Sikorski's first appearance at a Monitor breakfast, so welcome. Now for the ground rules. We're on the record. Please no live blogging or tweeting. In short, no filing of any kind while the breakfast is underway. And when we conclude at 10, the embargo is lifted, and Minister Sikorski does need to leave right at 10, so we'll get in as many questions as we can. As you know, if you'd like to ask a question, please send me a signal, and I will call on as many of you as time permits. And I'd also ask that you just ask one question for the first round, and then if we have time, we can go to second questions. Now, if you would like to make brief opening remarks, 5 minutes.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the breakfast, but I feel that we've had a Christian Science Monitor teas before.
We've had teas and coffees. In fact, we're going to have one the day Russia invaded Ukraine. Do you remember that?
Indeed.
Had to postpone a day.
That's right. I'm here again after 10 days, so I'm sort of treating this jointly. Before it was just me. I saw Jake Sullivan and I saw Tony Blinken, as well as others. I also took part in the both General Assembly debate on the second anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine and the Security Council debate in New York. And today I'm here, as you mentioned, with the President and Prime Minister, literally on the day that we joined NATO 25 years ago. It was my then boss, Professor Bronisław Geremek, who deposited the article of ratification in Independence, Missouri, yeah. Together with his colleagues from the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, which is what our Swedish colleague has just done somewhere else. So it's a celebratory visit in that sense, because we feel that both Poland and the United States seized the opportunity 25 years ago, and Poland is not only a safer and richer country today, it's also a much better ally of the United States. We were joining, quite frankly, as a consumer of security. We are now a contributor, an exporter of security. We were with you in Iraq with a brigade. We were with you in Afghanistan with a brigade. And today we are the main frontline state in the current emergency. Poland's economy has grown hugely since then, also its defense budget, including its procurement budget. When I was defense minister, you mentioned, in the late 2000s, Poland's defense budget was roughly $6 billion, of which a quarter was spent on procurement. Today's Polish budget is $40 billion, and half of it is spent on procurement, real money. And we have contracted F-35s, Apaches, HIMARSs, and other equipment from the US. And given this emergency in Ukraine, I think the visit by the President and the Prime Minister couldn't be more timely. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. So if I'm going to ask a question, or maybe two, and then we'll go around the table, and again, signal to me if you'd like to ask a question. So a few days ago, you said that the presence of NATO forces in Ukraine was not unthinkable, and that was on the heels of President Macron's comment last month, where he could not rule out the possibility of Western troops being sent to Ukraine. What does saying that out loud accomplish?
I think President Macron's idea was to get President Putin wondering what our next move would be, because to flip the logic, if you like. I think President Macron feels that we've been deterring ourselves, that we've been a little too helpful to President Putin in saying what we will not do, leaving him the security to proceed with his genocidal war. And the French no longer have an empire, but they do have a global outlook, which and they do think strategically, which I, for one, appreciate. And when you have this determined and vicious adversary, I think it's useful to occasionally put him on the back foot.
Does Putin's waiving of the nuclear option, does that concern you, or is that just?
Well, as a country that is
right there,
signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and it doesn't actually have nukes, of course it bothers me. But it has a history. You know, when I was negotiating the missile defense agreement with the Bush administration, they were threatening us every other day, literally. So that when I went to Moscow, I had to ask on live radio, Russian generals, please threaten us with nuclear annihilation no more than once a quarter. And you know what? They listened. The truth is that President Putin has found that nuclear weapons are actually very hard to use. I suspect China and India have read him the Riot Act to stop these threats. And battlefield nuclear weapons are actually very difficult to deploy, given that the Russian army is not equipped to operate in a contaminated environment.
Okay. So one more. What are you and the President and the Prime Minister hoping to accomplish realistically with today's meetings in Washington?
Well, first of all, we'll say thank you for President Biden's personal role in the enlargement of NATO. I understand that he was at the Senate, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a role in organizing the vote in the Senate.
Whip.
I heard a different expression. He was the floor
manager?
Floor manager, that's right. He was the floor manager of this particular piece of legislation, the treaty to include Poland, which took courage at that time. You know, not everybody was immediately convinced. So we owe him, we appreciate him, we will thank him. And we see President Biden as a long-standing, committed transatlanticist who understands the linkages between the security of the United States with the security of Europe and with with U.S. credibility in the Far East.
All right. Okay, Renzo Ruf from the Swiss CH Media to your left.
Mr. Secretary, how do you think the war in Ukraine will end? Will there be a peace treaty? Will there be a defeat of Russia?
Well, Swiss media have got His Holiness the Pope into a spot of bother in the last few days.
My language, I was in Italian.
This war can be ended in 5 minutes with one phone call from President Putin to his defense minister to get his troops out of Ukraine. If Russia withdrew back to the international border, the war is over. Unfortunately, Ukraine doesn't have that option. And let's remember that Russia has repeatedly pledged herself to honor that border. It was confirmed in the agreement between the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in the agreement on the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It was confirmed in this in the Budapest memorandum, of which Russia is a signatory, and Russia is a guarantor of Ukraine's independence and inviolability of borders. And they have a specific treaty on the interstate border of 2003 or 4. You can check. So all Russia needs to do is to respect what she voluntarily signed. And that's the best outcome because it doesn't require negotiation. Negotiations require some elemental level of trust between the negotiating parties. And if you were Ukrainian, you could be forgiven for not having all that much trust in the other side. That the next treaty will be honored.
Juliana Schäuble from Tagesspiegel to your right.
Okay, thank you for doing this. One quick question, 1.5 quick questions. In the US, there seems to be growing impatience with Ukraine. It's growing. How could Poland, how could the West, how could Europe prepare for less engagement of the US? And Chancellor Scholz is not really willing to deliver tariffs. What is your message to him?
Well, we will be. We are already telling our American allies that on this case, Europe is not a free rider. We are, in fact, spending twice what the US has spent on helping Ukraine. We are a confederation, so you have to count the contributions of both Brussels and the member states. And when you do that, Europe has already contributed twice, and we have another 50 billion package in the works. The Ukrainian state functions, officials have their salaried paid, pensioners have their pensions paid, the electricity system works because we, the European Union, transfer 1.5 billion euros to Ukraine every month, in and out, every month. Okay? And we have also contributed a great deal amount of munitions to Ukraine, including Germany. And I always say it publicly, in absolute numbers, Germany is actually the largest contributor. We are bigger on per capita basis, but Germany is doing a lot. More stuff is going to Ukraine from Europe. And I actually would dispute your impression that there is tiredness. There is actually, in the last few weeks, a sense of renewed urgency. We've had meetings on this Czech ammunition initiative, and there have been generous contributions from member states, including your own, to bring the ammo to the front as quickly as possible. We are also, I think on our last I'm hopeful now that we will pass the enlargement of the EU defense budget, wonderfully named the European Peace Facility. We originally, at the beginning of our 7-year financial term, put 7 billion in. That's already been spent almost entirely on Ukraine. And for this year, we need another 5 billion. And we are one step away from having it passed. And that will be fresh cash for arms for Ukraine. But of course, modern weapons are at a premium. Let's remember our discussions last year and the year before. At the beginning, some countries were reluctant to send anything but old Soviet junk. Yeah? And then, as the need arose, and as the Ukrainians were fighting like lions, we changed our view. So I'm hoping that kind of evolution is happening at the Chancellery as well.
Howard LaFranchi from the Christian Science Monitor, to my left.
Yes, Minister. So you spoke of President Biden as a true transatlanticist. And last week I was speaking with the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, who basically spoke of President Biden as perhaps the last transatlanticist president, just for historical reasons. But well, how is Europe preparing for an America that is likely to be less oriented towards Europe?
It's a fair point. I feel that the U.S. will be more engaged in the East, irrespective of who is president. And it started under Bush. President Obama named it the pivot, right? It's where your peer competitor is rearming, and it's where your attention is moving. And therefore, it's only natural that Europe should take a bigger part of the burden of defending the West upon itself. And it should be done on both national basis and on the European basis. The latest figures are that 18, I think, Secretary Stoltenberg said that 18 out of the 32 NATO allies are now spending 2% on GDP. Poland is spending well over 3% of GDP. 3% of GDP is that the defense ministry is guaranteed by a super law, but will actually spend 1% more from an additional fund. And that's real money. When you maintain your army at the same level, every extra dollar you can spend on equipment. Last time I was here in my previous capacity, I had a long conversation with a senior Pentagon official. I expected to have to convince him that European defense is not something the US should be worried about. He was reading my lines. They get it. They know that Europe shouldn't be helpless, shouldn't depend on the United States for everything, that it should be capable of taking on lower order emergencies. And this is why European defense would be useful to you. So before the war in Ukraine, what we were intending to spend the European defense budget on was so-called military mobility. That bridges should be strong enough to carry an Abrams tank, that there should be no legal barriers for NATO and European tanks to move across national borders. It's an issue. We need a tank Schengen zone. Right? In other words, and so my political party in the European Parliament, the European People's Party, which is the main Christian Democratic Party, has proposed that we create a reinforced brigade capable of deterring, say, Wagner Group in Libya. Do you really want to get involved in that? We should be able to deal with something like that. Or some warlord in the Balkans. Yeah? And for that we need a reinforced brigade with intelligence and lift capacities. We need some intelligence capacities, a joint headquarters, some satellite reconnaissance. And there are now ideas to have a defense council of the EU and maybe even a defense commissioner, someone who would on a daily basis make sure that we have the shells and the equipment that is needed. And we are so far behind the United States on all of this. It'll take us decades to stand on our feet, to become more strategically responsible. What I tell the French, take a look at my article in Foreign Affairs from last year. Don't talk about strategic autonomy, because that just sounds Gaullist and just splits Europe into New Europe and Old Europe. Talk about strategic responsibility. This thing has to develop in harmony, in strategic harmony with the United States. And then we see the point. And so should you.
Jonathan Landay from Reuters, across the table.
Good morning. Your president preceded his visit here with an article in the Washington Post yesterday in which he says he is going to press for all of NATO, for NATO's spending target to be lifted to 3%. It's now at 2%. Germany is still spending less than 2%. And I'm wondering how practical that is going to be and whether or not you've gotten any reaction to that proposal.
Look, 3% was more or less what Western European countries were spending in peacetime during the Cold War. In peacetime. So this is just the acknowledgement that the Kantian internal peace has ended. That we have clearly a revisionist power attacking its neighbors, and that our disarmament and deindustrialization in the defense field have gone too far. And that you need to spend money upfront to bring back even the capacities to produce equipment. I don't know how the German budget plus the 100 billion extra, what that means total. But I think our president wants to show everyone the direction of travel. If, we have learned that when Putin threatens us, he means it. And we should do the obvious thing, which is to deter him.
Jack Detch from Foreign Policy at the end of the table.
Yeah, connected to sort of the 3% debate, I'm curious, when you look at sort of Russian Article 5 scenarios, and there's been calls throughout the alliance to prepare for war, what you're potentially looking at, how far the Russians have reconstituted, and just what timeline you'd be looking at for Russia to potentially test NATO?
That depends entirely on what happens in Ukraine. If Ukraine wins, and it is possible for Ukraine to win, then that will be the end of the Russian Empire. But if we allow Putin to conquer Ukraine, then the timescales dramatically shrink, because he will do to Ukraine what Hitler did to Czechoslovakia. Half the tanks that invaded Poland in 1939 were Czech. He will do to the rest of Ukraine what he did to Donbas, which is to take over the industry and the people, draft them forcibly into his army, and attack us with that enhanced capability.
Okay, I'm going to butcher your name. Kasia
I will.
Yeah, did you want to say one more thing?
One more word. And if that happens, and if we have Putin not in eastern Ukraine, but on the border of Poland, then guess what will happen? If NATO is to remain credible, you will need more foreign troops in Poland, including American troops. So if you don't want to send your people to Europe, the best thing is to defeat him in Ukraine.
Okay, Kasia Klimasinska?
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned that Czech initiative of buying more ammunition. Is Poland part of it? How much are we contributing? And also, there's this other initiative to sell Eurobonds to shore up European defenses. Is Poland supporting that? How soon should that happen?
On the Czech ammunition initiative, yes, we are in. I can't tell you how much, but it's substantial. And the contributions by the various member states have been very substantial. I'm pleased with the process, but I can't tell you the details. Your second question?
About the Eurobonds, of course, because I'm from Bloomberg. So
Sure. The idea that's doing the rounds, and I just it hasn't come to my desk, is that the time scale for spending the COVID recovery fund is such that not everybody will be able to spend and invoice the money in time. And there are some ideas, it's literally just ideas, that maybe the unspent borrowing capacity there could be used for rearmament, because after all, it's actually somewhat similar to COVID. Having health capacities for a pandemic you don't wish is a little bit like having an army for a war you don't want. But insurance costs.
So it's the same. It will be also Europe, like a joint insurance from.
Well, we've already approved the borrowing of whatever it is, 750 billion, right? So it's only about, it would be, but I'm literally just speculating now, okay? It would be moving the direction of spending the cash that's raised from those issues, okay? But there's of course obviously a third source of money for defense, particularly of the defense of Ukraine, which is the resources of the aggressor.
Yeah, the stuff that is under sanctions.
Yeah, the frozen Russian state assets.
Eli Stokel's from Politico.
Can I ask you about the assets of the aggressor? That's something that the president is reportedly open to thinking about. The Treasury Secretary has said that she thinks that's a good idea. Is that something that you and that the Polish delegation today plans to push him further on? And perhaps related to that, how dire do you assess the situation to be in Ukraine right now? Because I think given the movement that we've seen in the last month or two, there's been a lot written about this is a pivotal point. They're running out of ammunition. Obviously, the president, people here tried to impress that on the Speaker of the House a couple weeks ago. Didn't seem to move him. How critical is it there, and how critical is U.S. assistance to keeping Ukraine in the fight?
I've already told you how much Europe is doing, but we physically don't have the weapons that are needed at the front. You have the weapons. So Europe is crucial on the financial side, the United States is crucial on the military side. And yes, I repeat my appeal to Speaker Johnson to let the matter to a vote so that American democracy can decide. And I'll repeat that if the American package doesn't arrive, then, as you say, Ukraine might be in difficulty, and that might eventually mean the need for more American troops in Europe. And secondly, I'm sure he knows, but I can confirm that Russia is a country that persecutes religious minorities, including Baptists. It also persecutes non-Orthodox Christians, including Baptists, in the occupied territories. I hope he sees that, and he can do something about it, because Ukraine is a much more tolerant country than today's Russia. On the assets, the Russians moved most of their assets from the US to Europe in the months before the war. Our doctrine on this is developing in Europe. We have already decided in the Foreign Affairs Council of the EU to put the Russian assets in escrow. Second step will be to make the income from those assets available to helping Ukraine. And then there is the third step of using the assets themselves. My view is the following. Since the invasion was condemned in the General Assembly of the United Nations in March 2022 by 140 out of 190 members. In other words, one of the most overwhelming votes in the history of the UN. That is not just an opinion. That is not just a press release. That's actually the voice of the international community, that the UN Charter has been breached by a major country, a member of the UN Security Council. The legal analysis that I agree with say that this actually puts a duty on the international community to take countermeasures against the aggressor. It's no good just to say we condemn it. We have to reverse the aggression. And therefore, we are duty-bound not only to help the victim of aggression, but also to use the resources of the aggressor to undo the damage that it does. So I think we have a case.
Julian Barnes from the New York Times.
Thank you. When we get to peace talks between Ukraine and Russia to end the war, what are the kinds of, if NATO membership is off the table?
Of any intention to hold peace talks.
Well, I just mean some, in theory,
in
right?
particular, I haven't heard that President Putin wants any peace talks. He's talking about fulfilling the original aims of the invasion, which is the annihilation of the Ukrainian state.
I will rephrase to get to my question, which is, when the war ends, what sort of security measures will be practical between Europe and Ukraine if NATO membership is off the table? And what is your analysis of the path to EU membership for Ukraine when this war is concluded?
Well, as regards EU membership, we have not only named Ukraine as a candidate, we have actually opened negotiations. And we are in the phase of review process, so the screening process. So the Commission is now looking at the current Ukraine legislation and to see how it compares with the body of the laws of the European Union, to see where gaps or need to be addressed or changes to be made. And then we will be negotiating 35 chapters. Remember, though, that Ukraine is already associated with the EU. So in certain areas, it already fully applies EU legislation. I'm the guy who closed the text of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement during the Polish presidency of the EU back in 2011. So in terms of commercial and it admitted Ukraine into the deep and comprehensive free trade area, which means that in the commercial sphere, Ukraine already follows EU rules. We also, under the Eastern Partnership, we led Ukraine into a visa-free regime with the Schengen zone, which means that their entire interior ministry, procedures, institutions are compatible. So they have biometric passports, they have databases of passports issued, they have effective borders, they have readmission treaties. All that is already there. But it needs some further areas. Usually it takes about a decade to do that. So I would think, but Ukraine is already along this process. So a Ukrainian membership of the EU is conceivable at the beginning of the next decade.
And it's not going to be a Turkey situation where chapters remain open
Oh, that depends on two sides, you know. Yeah, if you have thousands of judges in jail, then it's kind of difficult to join the EU, yeah. Or even journalists.
And NATO?
Yeah, NATO. So if NATO membership is not on the table, what kind of security relationship is necessary to secure, you know, to defend Ukraine? Like, would Poland do a bilateral relationship? Is a U.S.-Ukraine agreement necessary to provide some sort of security guarantee if there is no NATO Article 5?
If Ukraine wins this war, and it can and it should, they'll have one of the strongest armies in Europe, and they'll be training us.
But is that a big if they win the war?
Well, you know, wars always flow this way and that way. This is a subject for for a whole conference. You should just remember one thing, that the Russian argument about having to invade because of NATO is completely false. At the time of the Russian Anschluss of Crimea, Ukraine was a neutral country. It was written in the Ukrainian constitution that they are a neutral country. And if it hadn't been for the Anschluss, Ukraine would not have applied. So, you know.
John Gizzi from Newsmax, to your right.
Minister, you mentioned the current Pope earlier in his remarks. I'll pose the same question I posed at this gathering 2 years ago to the Ukraine ambassador. Do the Pope's comments then, and repeated most recently to the Swiss press, do they help or hurt the cause of a solution in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, Poland is still a Catholic country, but I don't hold the brief for the Holy See. I personally suggested to His Holiness that perhaps he should suggest that Putin should have the courage to withdraw from Ukraine, because that would end the war more surely, and it wouldn't even require a negotiation.
And he said what to you?
No, I said it on Twitter. But I think it's very important to always remember who is the aggressor and who is the victim, whose territory is occupied and whose isn't. Ukraine doesn't occupy an inch of Russian territory. And I thought the traditional Christian attitude was to appeal to the wrongdoer to repent and to mend his ways.
All right, Olivia Gazis. I'm not going to try the middle name Polish, yes? Andrzej Czech. Okay.
Oh.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. You've already spoken to the criticality of the $60 billion supplemental that's languishing in the U.S. Congress, and despite promising steps being taken by Europe, the inability, for the Europeans to fill that gap, especially as Russian partnerships with North Korea, Iran, China are deepening and progressing. We had the intelligence chiefs here yesterday say that there will be more Avdiivkas if this funding doesn't come through in 2024. So there are some reports that the Pentagon is considering dipping into its stockpiles to provide assistance on an emergency basis to Ukraine. Given the question of time and how urgently this aid is needed, would you rather see that happening at the risk of disincentivizing Congress from taking more urgent action, Or would you opt for the status quo and hope that Speaker Johnson will put the supplemental to a vote?
How about doing both?
If it's not an option.
Take it down. It's my view to do both.
Okay, and if I could just follow on one of Julian's questions about the bilateral security agreements, because I think Ukraine has secured something like 7 with the Germans, the Canadians, the Estonians most recently. Is Poland considering its own bilateral arrangement with the Ukrainians?
With the
And are you-
G7 proposals?
I think it stemmed from that, but it was also sort of parallel to what
Yes,
was.
we are.
Okay, you're considering one, but
We,
not.
we are in the process of formulating our agreement, which is modeled on the existing ones. I just want you to know that we are processing now the 45th package of military assistance to Ukraine as Poland, okay? And the last 2, I'm leaning towards my director of security policy, are about $100 million each, right? So count that, 45 times 45. We feel we're doing a lot. Plus the assistance to refugees, plus our national bank has a credit line to the central bank of Ukraine, which helps to maintain the value of the Ukrainian currency, which is potentially also very costly.
Are you Nana?
Yes,
Nana Sajaya from Fox.
Fox News.
Fox News.
It's an election year here, was supposed to be in Ukraine, and in less than a week, Russians will be heading to election polls.
I wonder who will win.
Yeah, big question. I know. Given everything, Ukraine, Navalny, and all things considered Russia, do you think the United States shall declare Putin an illegitimate leader?
That's tricky. I mean, he's certainly not a democratic one already. He sends death squads to European capitals. He sent them to Berlin, to London, to Salisbury, other places. In the Polish doctrine, we don't recognize governments. We recognize states. And we deal with whoever is in charge of that state. So there you have it. But different countries have different doctrines. I mean, we are dealing with other viciously undemocratic countries around the world.
Can you follow up on that? The resolution by the Parliament, in the European Parliament, the Commission, I think it was in October of last year, calling on states to declare Putin an illegitimate leader. So do you think it shall be like taking the US?
Well, certainly a leader who murders his political opponents is not legitimate in the sense of expressing the will of his people. But to do so, officially, I'm not sure what the implications would be. We still maintain diplomatic relations with Russia.
Okay, are you Felicia Schwartz from the Financial Times?
Sure.
To your left.
Thank you. 2 questions. First, with the 75th anniversary of NATO coming up and to be held in Washington, D.C., if the fighting remains where it is, what do you think that means for the alliance, and what kinds of deliverables for Ukraine might come forward to sort of contrast with this projection of where things stand? And then I'm wondering if you could just respond. The president last night said that there doesn't need to be additional troops on the border with Poland, and I wonder if that is Biden's kind of opening line, if you think you can convince him otherwise.
Well, at the moment we have about 10,000, and while Ukraine is fighting, that's we are pleased with that. But if Putin, have you ever been to the Polish-Ukrainian border?
Yes.
It's in the middle of nowhere. It's literally across an agricultural field.
Yeah.
If we had Russian tanks on the other side, inevitably NATO would have to beef up its forces on our side. But I've made that argument already. I hope our anniversary will spur us into greater solidarity against a country that's been invaded because of its European aspirations. This has all been because the majority of Ukrainians want to do actually more the European Union than NATO. But it means broadly our European transatlantic democratic family. And you know, it's also about respect for borders in Europe. All borders in Europe are artificial. All of them. Even an island nation like the UK. The border in Ulster is an artificial border that is an accident of history. Everywhere in Europe you have people of different cultures or language living across an international boundary. Everywhere. And we used to have wars over this kind of stuff. But we've agreed after 2 world wars that actually the way to manage it is to give everyone the cultural and linguistic rights that they ask for. Yeah. I spent my skiing holidays in the Italian Dolomites, which I recommend to you. You get German management of the ski slopes and Italian food, not the other way around.
Some Polish tourists.
Okay. And the Italians call it Alto Adige. Germans call it South Tyrol. The majority language is German. And there used to be vicious wars there. Some hundreds of thousands of people died fighting up in the mountains during World War I. And there was even terrorism as late as the 1960s there. Okay? And now it's a heaven on earth because people decided, actually, if you have a street sign in 3 languages, there's also a local language called Ladino, which is descended from Latin, which is kind of mountaineer Latin. Well, why does it bother us? You know, let there be 3 sides. That's the European way. And Putin is trying to do it the 19th century way. And we've seen this movie, and we know where it leads, and we don't want it. So allowing Putin's law of the fist to rule in Europe is a recipe for a war of everybody against everybody else. And not only in Europe. When I spoke at the General Assembly 2 weeks ago, I quoted from a wonderful little speech just 3 days before the invasion by the Kenyan ambassador, who said that in Africa, we inherited these horrible borders from our colonial powers, where they all cross across tribes and history and so on. And we could have spent a century trying to move them to reflect national or tribal entities, but we decided not to do that because it would be suicidal. And that's why I oppose this invasion, because that's what Putin is. That's what Putin's justification is, and it's a completely unacceptable justification.
Oskar Gorzinski from Polish Press Agency at the end of the table.
Thank you. So you spoke about the need for the supplemental Congress. And Speaker Johnson is seen as someone guided by Donald Trump, and Viktor Orban has just visited Trump and said that Ukraine won't see a penny from his administration if he gets elected. So how do you see the prospects of the potential Trump presidency in that context? And also, I want to go back to your very first question, Linda, about Macron's comments. You recently said that there are already some NATO soldiers in Ukraine. Can you in any way clarify that?
Actually, it was Chancellor Scholz who said it.
Really?
Yeah. I think in comments on that eavesdropped conversation. So I was just referring to that. Any chance of another coffee?
And
Okay.
Wait, hold on. Wait, don't get up.
All right. Right.
You're,
All right, I'm mic'd
lose
up.
your
Yes.
umbilical
yes.
cord. Okay.
And as regards candidate Trump,
Yeah.
thank you for this invitation to interfere in the internal affairs of our biggest ally, but I'm not accepting the invitation.
Are you concerned
When I
about
was
the return of Trump?
when I was a member of the European Parliament, I would have boldly
Yes.
entered that
Jumped in.
arena, but as foreign minister, I'll pass.
You got to pass.
Do you think Orban's comments reflect accurately what Trump is thinking? And is Poland trying to get inside Trump's head right now as well?
Look, credit where credit is due. When President Trump called on allies to spend at least 2%, he was right.
Okay, at the end of the table, I'm sorry, I don't know.
Mike Glenn with the Washington Times.
Oh,
Thank you, Mr.
great,
Foreign
thank you.
Minister, for coming. Poland has more experience with being occupied by an aggressive
Thank you.
nation than virtually any country in Europe. How much?
I could think of a few more.
Well, in recent years, and how much of? I'm also covering Polish rearmament. It's been going great guns. You're buying from South Korea as well as from the United States. How much of your thinking on that is informed by your past history, or specifically by what's going on in Europe, or are they all sort of merged into one?
Okay, you've just touched on one of my favorite subjects. In fact, every country in Europe has been occupied at one stage or another, except one, Britain. And that explains Brexit to you. Everybody else knows that joining up parts of your sovereignty with your neighbors is less of a sacrifice than the risk of war. Okay, that is exactly the origin of the European Union. Yeah? Because there's 1,000 years of history there. But yes, if an Israeli is threatened by Iran, they'd better trust them. When we are threatened by the leader of Russia, we also trust them on that they mean it, because they've done it so many times before. Yes, yes.
Amy McKinnon from Foreign Policy.
Thank you. The Estonian Intelligence Service warned, I think it was last month in their annual report, that they expect that Russia may look to double its forces along the northern border with Poland. I'm just wondering whether...
Northern border with Poland?
Along Russia's northern borders. Sorry, Finland, not Poland.
Right.
I'm wondering...
No, you didn't make a mistake. We do have a northern border with Russia. But I was going to tell you an interesting fact right now. There's the Russian exclave around the city of, they call it Kaliningrad. We don't like the name because Kalinin was the speaker of the Supreme Soviet whose signature is on the Katyn order to execute Polish prisoners of war. This is the kind of Russia we're dealing with, you see. They were never de-Sovietized. They never atoned for the crimes of Sovietism. And that's why they're doing it again. But the interesting fact is that in that exclave, we are told there are very few troops left right now. They've all been deployed to Ukraine. What does it tell you? It tells you that Putin knows full well that NATO is a purely defensive alliance. If he thought that we would take advantage of his weakness, he wouldn't do that, would he?
That's a good point. I was going to ask, have you observed any kind of changes in Russia's posture, in its military posture along its northern borders, and any change in Belarus along the same lines?
from what we hear, the majority of assets have been deployed to Ukraine, including anti-aircraft assets, including all kinds of assets.
All right, so John, did you already ask your question, or did you have a real question you wanted to ask? That was just a side. That was just a side question, okay.
Yeah, Mr. Foreign Minister, I was wondering, do you think that when you come to Washington and have this message for the Speaker of the House saying, you know, put the supplemental up for a vote, do you think that argument is undermined when Americans look over at Poland and see, you know, farmers spilling over grain and an unwillingness to, you know, in some parts of the society buy Ukrainian grain? Which some people would say that's the least that a neighbor can do, and we're over here on the other side of an ocean.
I agree with you that it doesn't help. We want both Ukraine to win and for our agriculture to survive. Look, Europe is an agricultural cartel, just like the United States. Right? You limit what food, what grain comes into your country. And when Putin imposed his blockade on the Black Sea, in the spirit of solidarity, the EU raised the barrier. Okay? So Ukrainian grain flooded across the EU frontier. 2/3 of it stayed in Poland. Because of transportation is apparently an important part of the price. So Polish farmers bore the brunt of the solidarity of all of the EU with Ukraine in this area. Okay. There is also a structural issue. In Poland, average land holding is 11 hectares. Half of this agricultural land in Ukraine is owned by so-called agro holdings, the smallest of which is 10,000 hectares. Plus Ukraine has 37% of the world's black earths, the best soil in the world. You try to compete with that on 11 hectares. Plus, Ukraine has basically won the war over the control of the western half of the Black Sea, and Ukrainian grain is now again flowing through the Bosphorus to Africa and China, which are Ukraine's traditional markets. So, while helping Ukraine fight, we need to negotiate the agricultural part of Ukraine's membership of the EU, but from the position where it was before the war, and not from the position of unilateral admission of Ukraine into the EU in the grain area. It's a real political issue in Poland. And we are having intense negotiations with Ukraine because they also see that this issue is not helping the overall sympathy for Ukraine in Poland, and Poland is vital because without Poland you can't get this stuff to Ukraine. But it's very, very difficult. Also because Russia had a bumper crop last year, and grain prices worldwide are depressed. So our farmers are really suffering. Yeah. It's a real issue, but very hard to. If it was simple, we would have solved it already.
Okay, it's 9:59. One more question, Marek Wakuski from Polish Radio.
Sure.
One more question on the 3% threshold. Aren't you concerned? Right now, only 3 countries, 3 NATO members, are over 3%: the United States, Poland, and Greece. Aren't you concerned that moving the post right now from 2 to 3% would give the critics of NATO here in the United States an argument that Europe is not paying enough? I can imagine Trump at his rally saying, look, 29 NATO countries are not paying even 3%. Only we, Poland and Greece, does. I have a feeling that it might complicate things and give an argument to the isolationists in the United States, to the MAGA movement. What's your take?
Well, no. I mean, President Trump's demand has been for 2%. I think Poland giving a good example, spending more than 3, helps the argument. And we need to mobilize our allies in Europe for this emergency. You know, the time of spending the peace dividend, unfortunately, is over.
All right. It's 10:01. I
Yep.
promise I would get
Yep.
you out of here
Thank you.
quickly. Thank you, and thank you so much for coming.
My
and
pleasure.
hope to see you again.
My pleasure.
All right.